Hello everyone and welcome to today's Google Hangout with Professor Mike McCarthy, your consultant for Corpora and the classroom. This week we're going to be discussing the English profile and its practical applications.
Hello everybody, it's good to be back here again, and I hope that you ask some questions about the English profile project, and I'll be very happy to answer them. So I look forward now to beginning this chat with you.
Okay, thanks. So the first question is, can I find out what grammar I should teach my students through the grammar profile?
This is a very important question because the English grammar profile and the English vocabulary profile are both descriptive lists. So the grammar that you find in the English grammar profile is not a list of things that you must or even should teach your learners. The point about the project is that it provides you with evidence and examples of how learners all around the world at the different levels of the Common European Framework of Reference actually use English. So it's a description of how they use English. It is not a list of things which every student must know or that you must teach to your students. The purpose of the profile is to establish benchmarks that you can look at and see how your students are rating in comparison with typical students, maybe in your own part of the world or anywhere else in the world. We think this is important information for any teacher. All of us like to know where our students are and what have they achieved. And by looking at the English profile, the vocabulary profile and the grammar profile, you can get a very good idea of how your B1 learners or A2 learners or B2 learners relate to other A1 or B2 or C1 or whatever level it is all around the world. But don't look upon it as a list of things you must teach. It is up to you to decide which of the vocabulary and which aspects of the grammar your students will need, either for their own personal everyday life or for their jobs, or if they're going to study overseas or studying in an English language medium context. You will make those choices based on your own experience, based on the demands of the curriculum in your country or your situation. The list that we provide is there to help you make those choices, because not only do we list the items in the grammar and the vocabulary, but we also give you advice on meaning and structure and how these particular pieces of grammar and vocabulary are used. So that's why we think it's useful, but it is not a prescription. It is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. So you can use it to inform your own decisions about what you should be teaching your learners, but it doesn't make the decisions for you.
No, exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. It informs you, and you can then look at your own course books, your own school curriculum, your own national examinations, and what they demand of you, and relate that to the English profile. And of course, you may decide that there are things in the English profile which seem to be used by students at your students' level all over the world. And you might say, well, I think it would be a good idea to focus more on that particular feature or that particular area of vocabulary. So you can make those decisions, but you might also decide that a particular type of vocabulary which is in the English profile is not really important or necessary for your students. And if that's your decision, then it doesn't matter. You don't have to follow what is in the profile.
Okay, thanks. Everybody who's watching, you can type questions into the chat on the right-hand side so that you can let us know what questions you'd like Professor McCarthy to ask. While we're waiting for some more questions to come in, Mike, is the grammar profile complete now, or is there more to come?
Well, the grammar profile is complete in its first version, as is the English vocabulary profile. But in both cases, for the grammar and the vocabulary, we consider them to be ongoing projects. And if you look at the English vocabulary profile website, for example, it says there just how important it is to get feedback from teachers and other users around the world so that we can constantly update it and revise it. What we have available for you at the moment is the first versions of the two projects. Besides the grammar and vocabulary projects, we also hope in the future to be able to provide tools for skills teaching, for example, speaking skills. So this is a longer term project, but when that is complete, you will also be able to look at what aspects of speaking skills are typically used by learners all around the world, and other resources such as pronunciation and intonation resources. So the project is going on and will continue. It's been in existence for almost 10 years now. In fact, we'll be celebrating 10 years of the overall English profile program next February. But so far, because it's such a huge project, what we can offer you is the grammar profile and the vocabulary profile, both of which will be adjusted and updated, but we do need your feedback. So as you use the tools which we've offered, and I hope you will, as you use those tools, please send us your feedback, and you can do this through the English profile website. You can contact the program researchers.
Thanks. How did the researchers decide which parts of English grammar to put in the profile?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, because really the grammar of English has a number of perhaps rather obscure features which your learners might never be interested in or never need to know. So what the researchers did was they tried to focus on what we call the canon of English language teaching. The canon meaning the agreed set of grammar that everybody around the world considers to be important to teach our learners. And we can find this canon in, for example, course books. So if you look at a range of commercially produced course books, there's quite a lot of agreement as to what you should teach, especially at the lower levels. Everybody is agreed that you need to have a knowledge of talking about the present, the past, and the future. You need a knowledge of, for example, the most common verbs, especially the modal verbs like must, can, could, shall, should. You need to know about the definite article and the indefinite article. You need to know about other determinants like this and that and these and those and my and your and his, and so on. It does get a bit more difficult as we go up the levels, however, in deciding exactly what to teach, for example, advanced level learners at C1 and C2. There are interesting decisions to be made there. But generally speaking, if we look across the range of course books that you've probably used yourselves in your schools, you'll find what we call the canon of ELT grammar. We can also see this canon reflected in examination syllabuses and national syllabuses around the world in different countries. By bringing all that evidence together, the researchers were able to focus on those aspects of grammar which really are at the heart of learning English. And some of the more perhaps obscure, peculiar features of the English grammar might not be so important for that canon.
Okay, thanks. And for advanced level students, is the information at the advanced level different from other levels, or?
Well, yes. Well, I just mentioned that, the advanced level. Let me take it in two parts, vocabulary and the grammar. The advanced level is different in both vocabulary learning and grammar learning. And in the case of vocabulary, I think there are two important things that advanced level learners do or focus on, which are different from what lower level learners need to focus on. When you're a beginner, you just need to learn the most common words in English, probably about 2,000 of the most common words, which enable you to survive in day-to-day communication, in speaking and writing. But once you get beyond that level, for most learners at the advanced level, there is a tendency towards specializing and focusing your studies in particular directions. For example, academic English, or business English, or vocational and professional English of some sort. Therefore, the English vocabulary profile for the higher levels also looked at evidence of academic word lists and professional context for the learning of vocabulary. So that's one feature in which the advanced level is different from the basic core level of learning vocabulary. Another feature of advanced level vocabulary is idioms, idiomatic expressions, which tend to be not very frequent. Therefore, we don't need to teach them at the lower levels. You can survive in everyday communication without them. But as you move into the advanced level, perhaps you're going to read more, perhaps you're going to listen to and get involved in more sophisticated and complex conversations, then at that level, we've introduced more of a focus on idiomatic expressions as well. So that's two examples of how the vocabulary is different at the advanced level. In the case of grammar, one of the things the researchers have done with the grammar is not just to look at more complex structures, though of course this is what does happen as you go up the grammatical levels, but perhaps the most interesting feature is the expansion of the number of functions and meanings for the grammar that you already know, that you have learnt at the lower levels, an expansion of the function and meanings of those grammatical items which take you to a higher level. So if I were to give an example of the verb will, the modal verb will, the first thing you learn about it is that you can use it to talk about the future, decisions about the future. If I pass my exams, I will go to university. I will do this, I will do that. And you probably learn that at very basic level, certainly by A2 level. But at the B2 level, and maybe C1 and C2, you can come back to that word will and look at other meanings of it, that we can use it to talk about things that happen regularly in the present. Talk about your day-to-day activities and habits. I will usually have a cup of tea at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I'll read the paper for half an hour. So you're using will to refer to things that you do regularly on a day-to-day basis. So to sum up, the grammar as it moves up towards the advanced level doesn't necessarily always just go on adding, excuse me, new and more complex structures, but there's a focus on what the grammatical researchers have called grammatical polysemy. Polysemy means having more than one meaning. And just as words in the vocabulary have several different meanings, almost all words in English have more than one meaning, apart from very specific scientific terminology, then the grammar is the same. The grammar also has several meanings, and part of becoming an advanced level learner is to expand the number of ways and meanings with which you can use a particular piece of grammar. So the English grammar profile does that. As we look at the more advanced levels, you will find familiar words, familiar pieces of grammar, but you will see how learners are beginning to use them in more expanded, broader ways, and with a wider range of vocabulary, because the grammar and the vocabulary grow together, or at least we hope they do if our students are learning well. The grammar and vocabulary grow together, so you also see an expansion in the vocabulary that is used with a particular piece of grammar or a particular structure.
Okay, thanks. Don't forget, everyone, that you can type your questions into the chat box at the side. We're particularly looking for questions about the English profile, and specifically the English grammar profile, ideally. But okay, so how can teachers use the English grammar profile or the English vocabulary profile to save time in lesson planning?
Well, yes, I said earlier that the profiles are simply descriptions of how learners use language, but as a teacher can use these profiles to take shortcuts, if you like, towards preparing lessons or making plans for tests and assessments in a variety of ways. Firstly, of course, there is the simple fact that the vocabulary and grammar profiles give you some idea of what a typical learner at that level should be able to use. And so you might, if you're teaching a B2 class, then it's very economical and quick for you to go and look at the B2 vocabulary profile to find out what the targets typically are for that level. Now, another thing that you can get, that there are more sophisticated things that you can get from the profile, is, for example, you can anticipate the kinds of errors and problems that learners will have at any particular level, because the grammar and the vocabulary profile give you actually learner examples for every level. And also the fact that learners do make mistakes. And if a feature of grammar or a particular piece of vocabulary is not yet acquired at any given level, so it's, for example, if a grammatical structure is a B2, what we call a B2 structure, then this is probably because learners who are exposed to it before that level have found it difficult, they've been struggling with it. So it gives you that way of saying, yes, now these are the targets, these are the things I need to focus on, because my learners aren't yet using that particular piece of language appropriately or correctly. So it enables you to focus. And of course, it also enables you to take the vocabulary and the grammar straight off the screen and put it into your materials. The vocabulary profile, for example, has some very useful facilities where you can look at particular topics like shopping or money. And if that's the target of your lesson, we have already established the typical vocabulary for that topic that you can use. And so if you're planning materials or planning tests, it takes a lot of the worry out of it. It enables you to say to yourself, yes, this is reliable information, and if I want to make a test to see where my learners are, then I can base it on the benchmark that I get from the profiles. So I think it does help you to make some shortcuts in terms of anticipating what your learners need to learn in terms of achieving a particular target. It enables you to design more efficiently tests and quizzes for your classrooms. And it enables you to focus in on particular topics in the vocabulary without having to go searching around and thinking, oh, what words will they need to talk about money and sports?
Okay, thanks. Do you think it can help with making decisions about reading for students. We've got a question from McCarthy Nikki, who is asking about what kind of books she should give learners who are taking lower in proficiency exams. And I was wondering if the English profile could be helpful with that.
Yes, I think actually there are other shortcuts you can take towards getting appropriate reading. The profile will certainly help you because, for example, if you had a particular piece of reading, a text, or even a book that you think you might want to recommend to your learners, then it would be a good idea indeed to dip into, to look at it yourself and read the text as a teacher. And anywhere where you think there might be difficult or challenging vocabulary, you could check that against the profile, indeed. If we're just talking about individual texts, an individual piece of reading text, you can, of course, go online and go to a website such as the Complete Lexical Tutor website, where you can actually upload your text and get back information about the level of that text, which is a very quick way of doing that. And of course, there are graded readers published by the publishers. So the Cambridge graded readers, which are appropriate for different levels, are based on information from corpora in the same way that we base the profiles. But yes, the profile, I think, is a very useful tool. It can't take your whole text and immediately tell you which level it's appropriate for, but the combination of your experience looking and choosing a particular text and then checking it against the profile, I think will give you a pretty good idea of whether that text is too difficult for your students or too easy. I'd like you to try that out. Perhaps you could try it out and give us feedback as to how quickly and efficiently you're able to compare reading texts by using the profile. It's a good question, and it's not what the profile was initially developed for. That wasn't its purpose, to grade text, but we'd be very interested to hear whether you think it is a useful tool for grading texts in that way that I've described.
Yeah, so please, McCarthy and Nikki, if you do look into that, do get back to us and let us know how that goes. Okay, do we have any other questions? If you do have questions, please just type them into the question and answer sidebar. While we're waiting to see if we've got any more questions, just like to ask Mike, was there anything that particularly surprised you in the results and the information in the grammar profile?
I think there were a couple of things in our discussions with the two main researchers, Dr. Anne O'Keefe and Geraldine Mark, who did the main research, and then a panel of advisors. We would all look at this together and discuss them. There were a couple of things that surprised us. I think one thing that surprised us is very often very low-level students at A1 and A2 are able to use what look like quite difficult grammar structures. But what you find is that in most of those contexts, they're using a grammar structure with one particular verb or one particular noun. So we find even A1 learners using sentences with if, but they're very simple sentences. We find them using structures such as I would like. So they're using would, that sort of conditional would, but they're only using it with like. And then what you notice as they go up the levels is, of course, they start adding other verbs and using would with a wider range of vocabulary. But we were surprised that if you just ask the computer, show us how learners use the word would, then the computer will often come up with the result that they all use it. But you have to look more closely to see that there's a very restricted range of vocabulary. That was one thing. The other thing that surprised us and I think this was the basis of my previous answer, was just how important is this whole notion of grammatical polysemy.
Mhm.
As I mentioned before, that you realize that what learners are doing is not just adding more and more structures to their good learners, but the learners who progress up the levels, the ones who achieve B2 and C1 and C2, it's very clear that what they have done is acquired more meanings, more functions, more ways of using the core grammar, the grammar of the canon. And I don't think we were expecting that so much. I think I myself, as perhaps any typical teacher would, had expected that you would see that the beginners knew very little grammar, they just had a very narrow range of structures, and at the advanced level they knew hundreds of different structures and syntactic features. But it wasn't that simple. The beginners were using quite a wide range of grammar, but a very narrow range of vocabulary with that grammar. The advanced level was still using the same grammar. They had, of course, learned some new things, but were basically learning more exciting, more sophisticated ways of using the grammar that they already had applied. So those were two surprises. I think, excuse me, apart from that, it is a question of really confirming some of the things that we know from our experience. And the more experienced you are as a teacher, of course, the more you are alert to the typical kinds of problems that your students encounter. So it was a combination of confirming what we already know about our learners and new things. Another surprise that we got in the grammar profile was just how persistent and stubborn some kinds of error can be. I'm thinking in particular of problems with uncountable nouns. And the noun information, for example, which we don't make plural, we don't say informations. Problems with that noun, which is a fairly low-level word. I think most learners learn it at about A2, at least B1. Even C2 learners are still making the same old errors with words like information and work and homework and so on. And that sort of surprised us. I think that we weren't expecting the errors to be so persistent, even right up to the advanced level. So yes, there were some surprises, and it's good that there were surprises, because if there were no surprises, there would be no point in having all the research done. So the purpose of the research was not only to confirm what we already know, but to find out things that we didn't know or things that we weren't expecting.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Carlos Moyanina from Peru, who asks, how much grammatical input you think L2 learners should receive before they feel confident enough to use the language, and at what stage should you be using an English profile as part of that process?
Right, well, that's a good question, because in some ways it's a question that's easier to answer for vocabulary. We know more about the ideal amounts of vocabulary that a learner needs. I mentioned earlier, for example, that to survive in English, you really need to have control of the 2,000 or so most common words in the language. Without those 2,000 words, communication is very difficult, and reading is certainly extremely difficult to read independently if you only know 2,000 or even 3,000 words. With grammar, we don't have an easy answer to that, except for saying that if you look at the English grammar profile, you will see that by the time we get to the B1 level, which you might consider to be over the threshold, as it was originally conceived, by the time you get to that level, you certainly need to have covered the basic tenses, the basic determiners, the basic prepositions, the basic modal verbs, and a range of basic conjunctions. And if you put that together with the vocabulary that you will know at that point, then I think you can more or less communicate quite effectively. In fact, somebody once said, I think it was David Wilkins back in the 1970s and 1980s, that with a lot of grammar and a little vocabulary, you can't communicate much at all. But with a lot of vocabulary and only a little grammar, you can communicate. But if you like, the real weight of the communication, most of the communication is carried by vocabulary. So going back to your original question, my advice would be focus on your learners being able to use the 2,000 most common words. But in terms of the grammar, just make sure you cover the tenses, the articles, and other basic determiners, things like being able to talk about possession, my, your, his, her, the other determiners like this, that, these, those, the basic ways of talking about time, and the ways of linking words, the conjunctions and, but, so, or, there, etc. With that, I think your students can communicate a huge amount. The more obscure structures of English grammar could be left until later.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Ali Ulus Kimav, who says, if I'm trying to find a new reading text at, say, B1 level, and I'm checking the difficulty level of a text, what sort of percentage of words above B1 should be appearing to make it sort of...
Okay, this is a very good question. And it doesn't only affect that level of B1 or B2. What we need to look at when we're looking at a reading text is the vocabulary load, the relationship between new vocabulary and old vocabulary. And to give you a simple example is, if every 10th word in your text is new for your students, it means that they will be able to understand about 90% of the text. Now that sounds a lot. Yes, I can understand 90% of this text. But in fact, research shows that if every 10th word is a new word, you actually can't read the text independently. You cannot do it. You will always be needing to look at a dictionary. To read independently, you need to actually know more than 95% of the words in the text. Ideally, 97%, but 95% is a good figure to go for. Now, 95% or 97% means that it's only 1 in 20 words which will be new. So that's in the case of 95%. You've got 5% of the text which consists of new words. If it's only 5% which is new words, that is every 20th word, then I think the research shows that you can work independently, because at that level you can begin to guess and infer the meanings of unknown words, and you won't have to be looking at a dictionary all the time. Okay, so it's a sort of magic level, a 95% level, that enables you to read independently. Anything less than that, you don't have enough information to be able to guess or infer the meanings of new words, and it's very demotivating, and your students will simply give up. They'll say, I can't read this text, it's too difficult. So what you're aiming for is a text where probably only every 20 words or every 25 words is a new word. I hope that will help you in choosing texts which are appropriate for your learners' level. If the text has too many new words, they'll just give up. It's just demotivating. It's a good question, really interesting question.
Okay, thanks. One final question from Carlos again. Carlos says that according to books like your Touchstone, where grammar is presented through conversation and readings, does the English profile suggest any alternative ways, but equally implicit ways for introducing grammar?
No, thank you for your question, Carlos. The English profile is simply a description of how learners around the world have used English in their examinations and other essays that they've written. It doesn't have any suggestions as to how you might teach that grammar. So it's not concerned with methodology. It's not concerned with ways of presenting. It's simply concerned with how learners have used that grammar in their examinations. But having said that, of course, you can find in the grammar profile, you will find example sentences. And these example sentences might be very helpful to you because the researchers have chosen those examples from the learner's work to be really illustrative of that particular piece of grammar. So that they look at hundreds of examples and they take out a sentence which they consider to be a really good illustration of the particular item of grammar that they are focusing on in the profile at that moment. So by all means, consider the examples in the English profile as being really good examples. But what we don't do is tell you any ways of teaching or presenting those examples. So in that case, I hope that you'll continue using books like Touchstone, where we have actually put the example sentences into charts and presentations and listening activities for your learners.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Mike. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now, but...
Yeah, thank you, and thank you everybody who's been listening in and looking in, and especially those of you who asked such interesting questions. And your questions are valuable to us because as we continue the work with the profile, we are building up a very good picture of the kinds of things that interest you and what your needs are in terms of profiles. So we do value those questions very much indeed.
Great, thanks very much. We'll stop broadcasting now. Thanks, everybody.